In the last lecture, we left off with this theorem, and I promised that in the next lecture, we would take a look at some of the ways this thing can be used to answer some specific questions. Now, before we do that, I want to look a little further at exactly what this theorem is telling us, because I think a lot of people may not be familiar with this kind of equivalent statements theorem. So if you looked at the proof on the website, you could reasonably think that this is saying, well, if A then B, if B then C, if C then D, and if D then A. It looks like there's four theorems in one. And yes, it is doing that, but it's doing a lot more. With this kind of equivalence thing, they aren't conditional statements. They aren't if-thens. They're if and only ifs. Or so if we just look at C and D, because those are the two that we're going to use in the first example, what this is telling me isn't if C then D, it's C if and only if D. In other words, a pivot position in every row. A has a pivot position in every row. If and only if the columns of A span Rm. Okay, so maybe you haven't seen this biconditional before, right? What does that mean? Well, it means we can read this both ways. It means if the columns of A span Rm, then A has a pivot position in every row. And if A has a pivot position in every row, then the columns of A span Rm. So it's really like getting two theorems for one, right? Because remember, with a regular conditional theorem, you can't read it backwards like that. Right, and even more important, if we do the negation of both statements, if we put nots in each one, right, to make it this, A doesn't have a pivot position in every row, if and only if the columns of A don't span Rm, that is also a true statement, right? And that is also, so it's called the inverse, right? It's also something that you can't do with a regular conditional, right? So we're actually getting a huge volume of information from this one proof, or this one theorem. Okay, so hold on to those two, right? Because they're the ones we're going to use in the next example, first example. So I have three vectors here in R4, and my question is, do these vectors span R4? All right, well, to answer that, I'm going to start by taking these vectors and I'm going to put them into a matrix. It's going to look like this. Now, if I do my row reduction algorithm on this, I'm not going to actually do it because I don't need to, right? So we'll see how this works. We would start by reducing these three values to zeros. All right, then we would move on to the second column, and again, we'd use the row reduction algorithm to reduce these two entries to zeros. Then we would go to the last column, and we would reduce this entry to a zero. So at this point, the matrix is going to look like this. I don't know what A, B, and C are, and I don't care, because this alone is enough information to answer the question. If you look at the last row, it does not have a pivot position. And our theorem says, if the matrix associated with the vectors does not have a pivot position in every row, then the vectors do not span, in this case, R4. And that's enough to answer the question. Okay, so there's actually a bigger conclusion we could draw from this, and this is one of the questions in the practice area on the website, so hopefully you're following along there as well. But I wanted to put this out there, something for you to think about it in the meantime. What relationship does this suggest between the number of vectors and the size of the space, R4 in this case, right? Three vectors are not enough to span R4, for example. Is there a way we could generalize that, right? How can that be generalized? Take a look on the website if you want to see some more about that. Okay, next question. I have this matrix equation, and I'm telling you to assume that this is true. You can show that this is true. We're using the definition pretty quickly. And my question is, how can we write that 5012, the vector on the right-hand side of the equal sign, as the linear combination of the columns of A? Okay, well, remember our definition, right? The definition of our vector equation, our matrix equation. If we have this setup here, how does it map to the equation? Well, A is the matrix, X is the first vector, the vector on the left, and B is the vector on the right. So what is the theorem tell us? What does our definition of matrix multiplication tell us? Well, this is the definition. And what I really care about is that third part, x1 v1 plus x2 v2, and so on. Right? This is telling me that if I have that product a and x, then the b vector is equal to a linear combination of the columns of A where the weights are the entries in X. Okay, so if I take 3, -1, 3, make that V1, 1, 2, 4, make that V2, and so on, this is what we end up with. Right, 5, 0, 12 is equal to 1, that's from the X matrix, first entry of the X matrix, times the first column of A, plus 3, that's the second entry of the X matrix, times the second column of A, and so on. And you can confirm pretty quickly that this is true, right? Just look at the first top values, for example. 1 times 3 plus 3 times 1 minus 1 times 1, yeah, that's 5, right? You can check that with the other two if you like. Okay, another question here. This is a very mathematician's question. Right? In your algebra classes, you're very focused on solving specific equations, right? Specific systems of linear equations, for example. Here, I've asked a much more general question. If I have this matrix A, does the equation AX equals B have a solution for every B in R3? Right? Is this always solvable, regardless of which R3 vector I pick to put on the right-hand side? Well, what I've got down here is the result of the row reduction algorithm, right? I put all the steps here. And you can see, if you look at the final version, that matrix does have a pivot value in every row. And if you flip back to the theorem and you look at items A and D, right, put those together, and we know that if A has a pivot column in every row, then for every B in R3 in this case, AX equals B has a solution. So in this case, the answer to our question is yes. Now, when would it be useful to know this? There are processes that we call iterative processes. These actually show up a lot in the application and the design of large language models. And in those kinds of processes, what you do is you start with an equation AX equals B, right? You know A and you know B, you solve it for X. Then you get a second equation where the solution to the first one becomes B, right? And then you solve that one. Then the solution to that equation becomes the new B, and you do this over and over and over again, and hopefully the results converge to something useful. Okay, there's always a concern at some point in that process. Is it possible for us to hit an equation that doesn't have a solution? Because that's going to bring the whole process to a grinding halt. Yeah, but our theorem here gives us a way around that. Yeah, because I was able to get this result from the row reduction process, I don't have to worry about it. No matter what solution I come up with at any step in the process, the next equation in the process is always going to have a solution, right? So that's going to kind of reduce the level of error checking that I have to do if I were writing a computer program to do that procedure. Our section specifically talking about the matrix equation. Our definition of matrix multiplication. Please don't think that we're done with that completely. That's going to come up repeatedly throughout the rest of the class. But in the next question, in the next set of lectures, we're going to look at kind of a way to generalize the solutions to these systems. Right? And in that lecture, this idea of linearity, right? These are linear systems versus rather than nonlinear ones. That's going to come in particularly useful.